So, yeah, let's see. Bear with me 1 second. I'm getting this pulled up.
And while Zoe's doing that, as a reminder, once they have responded to the icebreaker question, Maja will begin her presentation and we will have questions after her presentation. And after her question period is over, we'll hear from Dr. Toldson.
Perfect. All right, here's our icebreaker that we would like you two to answer. So it's our 5-finger introduction. So you're essentially going to use all 5 of your fingers. Your pinky, you're going to tell us one small thing about yourself. Your ring finger, you're going to tell us something you love. Your middle finger, you're going to tell us something you greatly dislike. Pointer finger, where you're going. And then your thumb, you're going to tell us where you've been. So Maja, if you'd like to start.
Ooh, what a great icebreaker. So I guess pinky, I'll say I cannot get enough ginger. I'm currently drinking ginger tea. I love any food that has ginger or lemongrass in it. So that's my small thing. Something that I love gatherings like this. Every time we have a move on meeting or I come out of the anti-racist Jubilee meetings, I feel energized and supported. Something I greatly dislike is, I think we're going to be talking a little bit of what we're going to be talking about today, the theft of definition, which I kind of love that term that I just learned in researching about critical race theory, but I think that there are so many definitions that have been misused or misappropriated. So the theft of definition is definitely something that I greatly dislike. My pointer, somewhere that I'm going. So I guess physically, I'm going to be I'm currently in Marquette, Michigan right now. A little bit later this week, a friend of mine is coming up and we are going to visit the Keweenaw. So just a little bit further up north. It's snowing here right now, so I expect it to continue snowing. So I'm going to go hole up just for a few days and kind of take myself away from everything just for a couple of days and a few days here. Where I've been, as Miss Evelyn kind of alluded to in her beautiful introduction, I started off feeling like I was a person who had no voice, that I was just kind of a small fish in a sea that would ultimately consume me. But I started getting active. I volunteered with Move On. They gave me the tools and everything I needed to make sure that I understood and helped other people understand that I have a voice and they have a voice. And that's where I've been and where I continue to go as well.
All right, well, thank you for going first. It gave me a little bit of time to think. So a small thing about myself, I'm obsessed with documentaries. Every spare moment I get, I watch documentaries, and I watch documentaries on a lot of random and odd topics. Something you love. Since I actually have a ring on my finger, it's hard for me to look at that statement and not say my wife and my family. So that's something or someone that I love. Middle, something I greatly dislike. Similar to Maja, it's when people argue a topic without knowing a lot about it, especially since it's so easy to find correct information now. Now it's a lot easier to find incorrect information because you don't really have to look for it. It just comes to you. But just with a little bit of effort on our own parts, we can just find the details that we need to have more information on different topics. Where I'm going, my next trip is going to be to Colorado Springs, and I'm going to be talking to I think about 500 school board members there, and that's going to be interesting, especially given the topics that we're talking about right now. So I'll be talking about using data for equity, and in terms of where I've been, just looking back at my life, I've been in situations throughout my K through 12 life where I've been in special education and I've scored low on tests and I've had problems with reading assessments. And I like to use my own life, especially my experiences in school, to help people to see that you can't really understand the potential of children just based on the traditional measures that we use.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much. We'll stop share there. And Maya, if you're ready to go, we are ready for you. And as she's getting ready, if everyone else will introduce yourself by putting your name and where you are located in the chat. That way we can all kind of read as Maya's getting ready. And Maja Sandstrom.
Thank you so very much. Let me just get through here. Hopefully, there we go. All right, everyone. So what we're talking about today, critical race theory, what is it? I think a lot of us have been hearing conversations about CRT, and we're here to hopefully dispel some myths and give you the tools, the language to chat about CRT in your own lives. So I have a question for everyone. How do you define critical race theory? What words or themes have you seen or heard around CRT in our news or social media? If you could put just a couple of minutes of thought into that, anything that comes into mind, just put it in the chat. So I just wanted to list out a few common assumptions about CRT. That CRT is a brand of liberalism, when in reality, critical race theory is an academic and a social movement. It's a critical thinking practice. It examines how race is used to perpetuate inequity and the subjugation of Black people. So an assumption is that the American legal system is applied equally across all races, that justice is blind. When in reality, our legal system has two tracks divided along power lines, which are usually race and wealth-based. An assumption could be that being colorblind, choosing not to recognize race as part of a person's identity, is an equitable idea that supports the notion that race shouldn't matter. When in reality, being colorblind leads to lack of awareness, discussion, and understanding of the ways in which whiteness provides privilege to white people to the detriment of Black people. So an assumption could be that teaching children about our country's foundation of kidnapping and enslaving mostly people of African origin is the same thing as teaching them that they were bad because they're white. When in reality, teaching children about the foundation of American history and our actual roots, the roots of our modern day struggle is the root of our modern day struggle around race, equality, and equity. Common assumption could be that accepting a baseline of white privilege negates all other marginalizations one may experience in their life. That if you're white, you haven't struggled. When in reality, accepting a level of privilege does not discount other marginalizations, nor does it mean that white people are always the most privileged in a group. So, what is critical race theory? At its core, critical race theory is a practice of consistently and critically examining the role of race and racism in our society. It critiques the social construction of race and the systemic racism, and that systemic racism supports a racial hierarchy, which places Black people at the bottom of that hierarchy. Kimberly Crenshaw, as some of us may know from her work on intersectionality, she actually devised the term critical race theory. It began as a movement at Harvard University in the 70s and 80s under the legal guidance of professor and civil rights activist Derek Bell. Critical race theory persists as a field of inquiry and study in the legal field today, and has expanded to throughout the decades in other areas of scholarship: history, education, sociology, psychology. So it grew out of critical legal studies, which contends that the law and other areas of academia are not actually objective and neutral. If they were objective and neutral, our law would actually be applied equally. Critical legal studies and critical race theory assert that justice is not, in fact, blind. It is not applied equally in all circumstances. So, a little background on the history of critical race theory. Many critical race theorists, scholars such as Derek Bell, had witnessed how the law could be used to help secure and protect civil rights, like the landmark 1954 case Brown versus Board of Education, securing for the first time a legal precedent that segregation was in fact unconstitutional. And as Supreme Court Justice Earl Warren stated, it was inherently unequal, depriving African Americans of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. Bell also witnessed the many ensuing legal battles that were required to solidify the Brown v. Board ruling, and became disenchanted with the idea that equity and equality would be achieved through the inherently unjust and inequitable legal system he was working within. So he asked himself, is this really the best way? Bell also recognized how the law was never really framed to work for the benefit of Black people, but rather potentially as a way for America to save face on the world stage. Bell argues in his paper, Brown v. Board of Education and the Interest Convergence Dilemma, Bell argues that the 14th Amendment on its own could not provide relief to Black people when the remedy of school integration also threatened the superior social status and political status of rich white people. So the law uplifted Black students by providing them access to white schools and presumably better education, while it also helped America seem like we were living up to our creed of liberty and justice for all during the early days of the Cold War. The interest convergence dilemma states that the advancement of Black people, especially in the delivery of justice, will only happen when it converges with the mutual interest of white people. While Brown v. Board certainly created a pathway for some avenues of integration, the road was far but paved for the true advancement and equal treatment of Black students. And we can see that today. Some of the vestiges of the shortcomings of Brown curriculums, which exclude the history of Black Americans. How many of us have just in the last 2 years learned about Black Wall Street, about the Tulsa Race Massacre, about Juneteenth? Some other vestiges are curriculums in education today that promote a predominantly white narrative of history. Biased standardized testing, as as Dr. Toldson alluded to earlier. School policies that single out disciplinary action for Black students, wearing natural hair, braids. Funding inequities. I know a lot of us have probably discussed this. And the persistence of racially segregated to this day. So, who created CRT? No one person created the idea of critical race theory, but rather it is a framework of thinking, a social movement that was birthed from the scholarly work of Derek Bell in the 70s and 80s and the development of the critical race theory workshop by Kimberly Crenshaw and other legal scholars of the day. Over time, the movement grew among legal scholars across the nation, mostly those of color, at law schools across the country. So I've listed a few of the pioneers of critical race theory here. Derek Bell, as I've been discussing a lot today, Kimberly Crenshaw, Cheryl Higgins, Kiara Bridges, Kendall Thomas, Patricia Williams. Some of these names I'm sure we've read in our research if we have performed any about CRT, but these are by no means the only folks who helped create and promote and maintain critical race theory. They're just a few. So what are a few tenets of critical race theory? Critical race theory asks us to recognize that race is not biological, but it's socially constructed and socially significant. It asks us to acknowledge that racism is a normal feature of society and it is embedded within systems and institutions like the legal system that replicate racial inequities and inequality. This dismisses the idea that racist incidents are aberrations or one-offs, that racism is the work of one bad apple, but instead are manifestations of structural and systemic racism. CRT recognizes that racism is codified in law, embedded in our structures, and woven into public policy. It asks us to reject claims of meritocracy or colorblindness. And CRT recognizes that it is the systemic nature of racism that bears primary responsibility for reproducing racial inequities. So how do we employ CRT in our lives? I'm just one person. What can I do? We need to rethink and reform every system in our society, every single one. We need to challenge racist systems that already exist and think critically about the systems within which we engage with one another. Legal systems, education systems, and financial systems. We can ask ourselves some of these questions. Who stands to gain from keeping those systems as they are? Who stands to gain from keeping us divided and occupied, fighting each other? What power do we have in the spaces that we hold to change the narrative, to start discussions? We as individuals must decide where we're willing to sacrifice our comfort to ensure the inclusion of others is prioritized in every space that we hold. We need to decide where we're going to speak up and where we're going to make a stand. What actions will we take in our own lives to increase awareness and champion equitable treatment for all? Who will we stand up and speak for when they're not represented? What spaces do we occupy with influence? And how will we wield that influence to create a world of equity and shared power? I want to thank you all so much for taking the time to listen. We'll be happy to share these slides with you if you'd like. I pulled this research from so many areas, If you would like to have any information about where I pulled this from, I'd be happy to provide some links and share some podcasts. Thanks so much.
All right, shall I jump in? Okay, thank you so much, Maja, for that presentation. It really gave a really solid overview, very brief, but very rich and concise overview of what critical race theory is. And that runs so contrary to what it's being cast as right now. So I want to open up a dialogue about, what's going on, why the sudden interest in something that's been around for 40 years, why the mischaracterization of it, how is it useful to us, and what can we do about all of these people who are saying that it's something that's bad? Now, first, we have to acknowledge that we do need critical race theory, systemic racism, and white privilege as terms to help us to understand a lot of things that can be very difficult to understand. We need to be able to understand why we don't have equitable outcomes, even when we make some changes in the diversity of the makeup of the school. We need to understand, certain things like a Black mother going to jail for driving her daughter to a district, to a different district to go to a better school. And then at the same time, you have a white mother who drives her 17-year-old son to another state to participate in civil unrest with an illegal firearm that he can't use legally, and he murders 2 people, and we don't even scrutinize that mother's actions. So the action of a Black mother who used her father's address to get her daughter to school goes to jail. White mother who gives who drives her son to participate in something that puts him in harm's way and ends up killing people does not get scrutinized. How else can we explain that other than a theory like critical race theory? So we needed to be able to understand these things. Now, when we think about how critical race theory is being used right now, there's a point of convergence. There's this past and this present and future that's starting to come together. Many of you all are familiar with the print on your rear view mirrors that says objects in the rear view are closer than they appear, right? It's the same is true about life. We tend to think about history as being a lot further away than it was. Let's take Emmett Till, for instance. Emmett Till's murder, which was a pivotal point in the civil rights era. When you look at demographic data, when you look at the year that Emmett Till was murdered, and you look at the demographics right now, nearly 30% of all white people who are living today was living when Emmett Till was murdered. So think about that. 17% of all living Americans, but 30% of all white Americans were living during that time. If you think about it, it was what we call the greatest generation. The greatest generation is the generation that murdered Emmett Till and implemented all of these policies. And then when you have Donald Trump coming to say, let's make America great again, there are these code words that gets put in the mix. Then there's also the saying, the future is closer than you think. There's a book by that title. I don't really know what that book is about, so I'm not endorsing it. But the title, the future is closer than you think, is also true. So we have the object in the rear view is closer, the future is closer. Now, when we look at the 2020 census that just came out, it showed that this is that from 2010 to 2020 was the first time since 1790 that there was a decline in the white population. Looking into the future, and this has been forecasted. I'm sure many of you all remember in the late 90s and the early 2000s, which is more than 20 years ago now. The 90s, there was this forecast of we are going to become a majority minority nation. But it seems so far into the future. They were projecting it out as around 2040, and then they redid that to 2035, and now it's at 2030. So if we look back just 10 years, the demographics is completely different now than it was 10 years ago. And 10 years into the future, we're at this point that we were talking about for all this time. So now we have the convergence of the two. We have all of these people who were, many who were around during Jim Crow. Most of them educated their children and taught their children certain values without really reconciling for themselves what happened during this time when we had this Jim Crow era. And you have this future that's imminent where they're going to be the minorities and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. And at the same time, you have people of conscience, Black people and white people who are accepting this new, beautiful diversity that exists, who have over the last 20 years seen all of this rich diversity in school, saying we need to change some things about how we operate. We need to teach things differently. We need to train our teachers differently. We need to have different perspectives on some of these things as not serving certain students well. So maybe we need to hire a chief diversity officer, the first ever for this district. Maybe we need to ask every school in this district to have an equity plan and talk about how they're dealing with equity. Maybe we need to have a dedicated data resource center that shows racial disparities in certain things. So these are conversations that started happening as we started to recognize the diversity among people who want to do the right thing. But in the backdrop, you have all these people who are fearful of those efforts and who want to go back to a time when you had this white majority that was calling all the shots and that was creating things to place them at an advantage. And so now we have the conflict between the two. Then 2020 happens and you have this acceleration, right? You have these murders that happen during the pandemic, during the time when all the attention was focused on it. You had Black Lives Matter protests, and you had school districts that were saying all of these things that we were doing to try to create a more diverse environment, we need to accelerate these efforts. And so critical race theory comes, or the anti-critical race theory movement comes to combat all of this. It comes among people who are opposed to these diversity efforts and who were shocked and appalled by the acceleration of efforts that they never agreed with to begin with. So then you have this McCarthyism. And many of you all know about how McCarthyism happened with the Red Scare. And there was a Senator, McCarthy, who used tagging people with a communist label as a way to root out people that they didn't like politically. And them being a communist had nothing to do with why he didn't like them, but he conveniently used communism. He branded communism as this thing and started targeting people who are artists, people who were social justice advocates. All of this he pinned it on them. So what we have now really is McCarthyism in education. We have people who are using critical race theory, trying to rebrand it as something that's that's Marxist. That's a term that they use, and they are making the argument that even if we aren't teaching critical race theory, the diversity efforts are being influenced by critical race theory, which they are trying to rebrand as Marxist. So what do we do about it? And I can't act like I have all the answers, and look forward to having a rich conversation and dialogue about this. But we have had quite a few discussions about what critical race theory is and what it's not. It seems like it's difficult for us to try to translate our defense of critical race theory into something that's helping us to to change the conversation that's happening. At the same time, the issue really isn't about whether or not critical race theory is something that's good and useful and should be taught in school. Critical race theory we haven't been teaching that at the K through 12 level. So the first thing we have to recognize is that this is really not about critical race theory. It's about stopping any reasonable attempt to create a different environment in the schools that will accommodate a more diverse student population, and not just racial diversity, but a heightened sense of awareness of a lot of different things, including gender issues, the LGBTQI community, students with disabilities. All of these types of things are things that we've been thinking about how to treat differently. And anti-critical race theory is really about trying to figure out how to stop a lot of these efforts. You can tell in how different detractors are introducing them and the context around how they introduce them. They want to stop diversity efforts. And so we really do need to refocus the conversation back on the diversity efforts that were already in place, that we're starting to accelerate, and that we can afford to pump the brakes on for a conversation with people who are just really trying to detract. Now, one of the things I found that was useful was looking at the laws that are being passed, because when you look at the laws, it's really something different than what the headlines are saying. And if we let the headlines define our perspective on the law, so if we let a headline make the determination that the law bans us from teaching Black history in school, then that could be problematic when the law doesn't state that. So let's look at Tennessee's law. And there's a headline, and the AP headline was, Tennessee bans critical race theory in school. So that was a headline. But when you actually look at the law, this is what the law says. And I'm gonna read it point by point. And then we'll open it up for a larger conversation. So first aspect of the law, one race or sex is the code prohibits teaching the following. One race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. Clearly, critical race theory does not teach that. It teaches that no race is superior to another race. Second thing, an individual, by virtue of the individual's race or sex, is inherently privileged, racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or subconsciously. When you include individual in that code, that's completely against what critical race theory is about. Critical race theory teaches that privilege is socially ascribed, not inherent to an individual. Third, an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of the individual's race or sex. Critical race theory teaches that race-based discrimination is wrong, clearly. Four, an individual's moral character is determined by the individual's race or sex. Critical race theory certainly does not teach that. Five, an individual by virtue of the individual's race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Critical race theory was developed to move on from this individual look at racism, as I said before, our interpersonal functions of racism, and to understand race and racism as institutional or systemic. And then it goes on to talk about these individual things, which again is against what critical race theory is about. It also prohibits teaching that meritocracy is inherently racist or sexist, or designed by a particular race or sex to oppress members of another race or sex. Critical race theory teaches that meritocracy teaches that is not inherently racist. Rather, systems of meritocracy can be constructed to favor one race over another. Thus, the word inherently makes the provision completely in line with what critical race theory is about. So I can go on and on, going point by point. There's 14 of them in Tennessee's law. And when you read them point by point, none of them actually prohibits critical race theory. So it's a narrative that it prohibits critical race theory, but it doesn't. So one of the things we have to do is to actually read the law and reframe the law. Now, Florida also passed the anti-critical race theory, banning critical race theory. And this is something from the law. This is a quote from the law. It says, instruction may not suppress or distort significant events such as the Holocaust, slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and the contributions of women, African Americans, and Hispanic people to our country as already provided in section and has a section number. Examples of theories that distort historical events and are consistent with the state board approved standards include the denial, armamentization of the Holocaust, and the teaching of critical race theory. So that's what it says. That's a quote from it. Now, when you go back to that section that they referred to, that's a section that was already in the law that mandated the teaching of Black history in Florida. So in other words, this law says that it doesn't counteract the section that's already in it. And it also talks about the distortion of historical events. So they can't distort historical events. So that means technically it's illegal to teach that Christopher Columbus discovered America in Florida. That's what it technically means, because he didn't, that's a distortion of history. That's one of the most common distortions of history. So understanding the law is very important to coming up with strategies to make sure that we're going in the right direction. So I want to close with this. And this is something I posted on social media. I said, you don't need to understand electromagnetic fields to use a mobile phone. And you don't need to understand critical race theory to stop being racist. Lay people don't debate electromagnetic fields with physicists because they respect the discipline and they like using mobile phones. But they will debate CRT with social scientists and legal scholars because they don't respect the discipline and they like being racist. Debating CRT is the latest scheme to avoid talking about racism and to continue being racist. Thank you.
Okay, so the floor is now open for questions. If you guys would just either use your raise your hand or put the word stack in the chat and we will recognize you. Okay, I see two hands raised as Jaden and Suzanne. And look, I'll start with you, Jaden.
Well, thank you for that, because I think it's something that's commonly misunderstood. I'm glad that there are people out there that do understand this, that can inform us on this topic. So my question for you was, we often see on social media those posts about people claiming that it's too young to teach their kids about race, when really Black students have, basically have been subjected to racism in their whole lives. So what would you say is the best way to advocate for lessons regarding race in the classroom?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, and Maja, you can certainly respond to this too. So the way that I always approach it is looking at the future of the nation, looking at the diversity that's happening, and also connected to globalism. It's really about what kind of children do we want to educate, and how do we best prepare them for a future that looks a lot different than the present, and it certainly looks a lot different than the past. It's not about making anybody feel bad about their race or about what anybody did wrong in the past. It's about accommodating all students and helping every student to understand their worth. Teaching the truth about our history and about who we are is really the only thing that we're asking for. is the problem is that very few people understand the truth. Like there was a white teacher who said that she has a difficult time teaching about slavery because it's such a painful period. And she has she said that she had a difficult time teaching it to her Black students because she felt like her Black students would become sad when they learned about slavery. And my response to her was, how are you teaching about slavery? If you're teaching about Black people during slavery, and you're teaching about the hundreds of slaves, people who were enslaved, who escaped every year, or every month leading up to the Civil War. If you're talking about the period of slavery the same way that you teach about prisoners of war, nobody considers people who were prisoners of war as someone that you feel sorry for. We celebrate people like John McCain, who was captured, who was in prison. And when Donald Trump said, he likes those people who wasn't captured, that was an appalling thing. It was against the grain. But we're teaching about Black history and the history of other people in a way that does not validate and illuminate the history. So it's really about sharing the glory of this country. It's not about making anybody feel bad, but it's about lifting other people up. And when you lift other people up, you create a more harmonious environment, and you create students who will be better citizens for a diverse country, and that will make a better contribution to this global economy that's imminent.
Thank you for that question, Jaden. I think I saw Suzanne's hand up.
You know what? Jaden asked the question that I was going to ask. How would you approach it in a classroom? And I'm a public school teacher here in Atlanta in middle school. And one thing I do have to applaud my school district for is that they did have an equity training at the beginning of our school year, and they're very open to diversity. So far, it's all about who's on the school board, but so far we have not had that issue, within the city. We can talk about things, in critical race theory, we all know is not what it's cracked up to be. It's a racist ploy. So I just want to say there are some school districts like myself, like mine, who are open to teaching the truth and who are open to the diversity of all students, because Atlanta is really diverse. So when we're doing SCL lessons, I'm real concerned about, it's like for us, they're preaching to the choir. What about rural America? That's where the issue really, really seems to be in rural America, and how can they get rural America on board? Because what happened to slavery is wrong, but to act like it didn't happen and we can just continue on, it's not the answer. So
yeah.
How would you approach rural America? To me, that's more.
Yeah, so
I was going to say, I'll chime in here just really quickly.
Yeah, jump in, please.
Just when is it too early to teach a child about history, right? So I think part of the reason white Americans are hesitant to accept critical race theory is the critical part. I think they see that and they say, well, so if we criticize one part of our past, then that directly reflects on American exceptionalism. So there's this idea that, and I think that this is where it's going, the idea is that if we critique the ways in which we conducted ourselves in the past, then we're critiquing American exceptionalism. So if we break down American exceptionalism in the mind of say, a person who lives in rural America, then I think that bleeds over into discussions about patriotism. Well, if you don't think that America is the best nation ever, that was created with all of the best democratic ideas, then you're not a patriot, and then I don't know how to treat or interact with you. So I think, the discussion is much harder when it comes to, folks in rural America who might ascribe to this idea that America is exceptional no matter what. whereas we are unexceptional. We are maybe the worst case of enslavement, of modern day enslavement. So I'll just end there, but Dr. Toldson, I know you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And just quickly, so what we want is equitable outcomes. That's what we want, and you don't want to lose focus on that. There in many rural areas, in most rural areas, there are not equitable outcomes. There are certain aspects of their student population that's not doing as well as others, and that's where the conversation starts. And after you started there, the question is, what do we do about this? Because we know that the status quo isn't good. And I'm certainly open to listening to anybody's idea about how to create equitable outcomes, as long as it's not, let's just keep things the way that they are. That doesn't make any sense. So discussing, and particularly in rural areas where you have brain drain, and you have an economy that needs talent in order to fuel it. You need people to become educated and invest in, you invest in education, you get a more educated workforce, and you build the economy in these towns. It's a no-brainer that you want equitable outcomes because it increases your economy. So the question becomes, if you have segments of your population that's not performing well, then what do we do about it? And again, we don't even really need to talk about critical race theory to come up with some reasonable things of what to do about it. We talk about, how are you teaching them? What are some of the bias that may exist when it comes to making decisions like who goes into special education or who goes into honors classes? How are you teaching them about their post-secondary opportunities? And do you have systems in place where all of your Black and brown children understand the vast possibilities that they have after college or after high school? So all of these are the things that we need to talk about. I have done many presentations in not necessarily rural, but certainly some red areas. And I always start with the data. The civil rights data collection is easy to get access to. I can pull it up on my smartphone. I can look to see who's in your gifted and talented programs, who's getting suspended, who's getting algebra in the 8th grade. And every time I pull up that information, I'm seeing certain races that are not getting the same opportunities as other races. So that's where we start. That's what we need to talk about.
Thank you. I think Casey has a question.
Yeah, hi there. I just think it's important to point out the political nature of why this is such a hot topic right now, and that these, right-wing think tanks or whatever have, like we were talking about in the beginning, have completely taken over the definition of what's happening here with very bad intentions. I mean, I think they want to create a race war to hold on to power, to, make their base feel fear and come out and vote. And I just worry that sometimes we let the kooky right wing set the narrative. And so I don't know, just wondering what you both think of that, because there was so much money poured in from these right-wing think tanks to get everyone all fired up about this, and I just think it's scary.
Yeah, you're right. And there's that saying: if you wrestle with pigs, you're going to get dirty. So you do have to be careful with how you engage them. My opinion on this is that the reason why they're pouring so much into this is because people like the people on this call, we were winning. And in many ways, we still are. And I feel that way when I talk to people who are in district leadership positions and who are trying to make decisions and talking to them about what they want and the future that they see for their district, what their desire is. And I haven't met a superintendent or anyone in leadership position at the district level that's saying that we're comfortable with these racial disparities and we don't want to change anything. They might be a little cautious and there may be the debate about what they want to change, but they do want to change. And I think because we were pushing them and moving them in a certain direction, the people that you're talking about, they decided to target the voting population, the people who were more politically oriented. And so that's why you see this big focus on the school boards. And there's a lot of friction between the school boards who are elected and who are a lot more vulnerable to being politicized. You see friction between them and the district leadership. So I think what we need to do is to continue to work with district leaders and to understand, just like when I talked about the Tennessee law, understand that politics and doing the right thing are two different things, and that these anti-critical race theories, which was incubated in politics, what we have to do is try to create firewalls in the school district to minimize the impact of politics. So if the superintendent of schools of Memphis Public Schools can look at the law with a grain of salt, but say this law does not prevent me from mandating equity training, and then continue to do equity training and help them to create that firewall, I think that's the best way for us to do. I would be very cautious about jumping into the other side of the politics of it, because of the risk that will muddy the issue.
And I'll just say too that it is a PR campaign. The demonization of CRT is a PR campaign. Like, money has been spent to make sure that a bunch of people don't understand what it is, but really, really hate it and are very vocal about it. So on a personal level, what can we do? When I'm scrolling through LinkedIn or when I'm scrolling through my social media and I see someone stealing the definition away, what I can do in that immediate time is I can respond, right? I can correct the record in that thread. Can't do it every time because it's happening way too often, but I can do it when I see it and I have the time and the mental space to thoughtfully, without pointing blame at the person who's posting it originally. That's what we can do, because we obviously don't have an organized, a bank providing us money to spend on PR and social media campaigns and email campaigns. We don't have that. All we have is ourselves and what we can do to teach the people around us.
Can I just add one comment to what you said about that? The other thing about that on social media is that I did some training with Common Cause about that very thing, and you have to be really careful about going in to correct the record, because then those posts get more engagement and fly around more. It's just such a web. Anyway, thank you both so much.
Slippery slope.
You know what? I wanted to, I was reading last week something in the newspaper, and I was wondering how much is this also playing into the ignorance of America? We're talking about reading level, and of course, being a teacher, we're always testing the kids' standardized tests. In America, they read, 50% of America reads at lower than the 7th grade level. 50% read right, and then the next, there's very few, we're right at 7th and 8th grade. That's our reading average. And if you don't know how to critically think, you don't know how to make inferences, and that's above the 8th grade level, then I think that's also the ignorance, is the lack of reading, the literacy is also, I think, is what's feeding this craziness as well, because if people are not able to think critically or draw inferences. Do you think also the literacy of America is feeding into this craziness as well? I mean, think about it. You got Bobart, who just got her GED before she got elected to Congress. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah, I think that the critical thinking is the biggest thing, which you also said, and the critical thinking and literacy are two different things. But I do think that the tendency of people like me to write and communicate above the level of the average person, and people who are saying the opposite of what we're saying, their effectiveness of communicating things at a certain level is an issue. So I think, the scholars, critical race theory scholars, and, people who know the right thing, we do need to get out of the ivory tower and force ourselves to communicate. And, because people in media, people who write for popular press, they're used to writing things at an 8th grade level. That's the standard at the 8th grade level or below, and they're comfortable with that. And a lot of things that we're talking about in terms of children needing things that validate themselves and to understand who they are and their worth and all that kind of thing, that could be written at the 8th grade level. But sometimes we choose to highbrow it a little too much. So I think that's something that we do need to think about.
All right, it looks like Pat has a question.
Hi, yes, as a person who was in the classroom for years as a substitute teacher, every time that we talked about the Constitution, we the people, I would stop and then say, well, we the people, all men are created equal. In a letter, the spirit of it was something like all people are equal. And I would have to, I would explain that, that's not really true. And that, because slaves didn't vote, obviously, and women didn't vote. And so it really, but, we're trying to work towards making it better. We got a long way to go. And I have to say that sometimes in the back of my mind, I was like looking at my back, like, these kids say this, because it wasn't in the plan that I had, what the parents say, but I said, you know what, I'm coaching it, or I'm saying it, and we're trying to do better. It's a positive thing, but that's just a small thing. And the second thing is, in a town near me, not my town, but not very far from me, a teacher was spotted at the January 6th, got fired, and was elected to the school board. And I have friends in that town. And it's and there's some of them are in official positions. And I think of how difficult it's going to be. And I'm going to make sure that people in that town get a copy of this recording. And it's scary. Mm-hmm. And my last thing is media responsibility, because media, when you said that, they're at the level they know. They could have easily corrected this CRT, correctly described it, and said exactly what it was and they didn't. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to address that, but I think that's also important. Thanks.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you definitely raised some very important issues. I think all of them are issues that we need to reflect on. And it is a scary time, but I'm not scared. Um, I think that change always comes with some tension. And, even though, we have some ridiculous people who are getting on the school board because of what's going on, many of them, this will be the first time that they have to get out of their silo and they have to listen to people other than the echo chamber that they're in. That's not to say I think they're going to come out, changed or have any epiphanies or anything like that. But the changes that's happened in our society, they want to reverse them, but it's going to be very difficult for them because of just the way not just demographics are moving, but technology is moving, the way globalism is happening. So there's just, there are changes that's happening in society that regressives just can't reverse. But that's certainly not to say that we need to sit back and just relax. Even though I don't think we need to fear, we do have a lot of work to do, and we have to be very, very vigilant to make sure that their attempts to reverse any progress is not going to work.
But you know what? I'm sorry. Can I see anybody else ahead of me? Can I speak?
Yes, go ahead.
I really appreciate what the two of you have been saying today, and everyone has been saying. I think when they talk about numbers, I always said to myself, and I'm not, don't beat me up for using South Africa, but it's not the numbers, it's what those in charge do, because the Black South Africans far outnumbered the white South Africans, but they ruled for hundreds, a couple hundred years. I have to go back and I know they ruled for over 100 years. So I'm saying the fear that's in their mind is just unheard, it's just made up. Also talking about demographics, I saw the demographics too, that people of color are catching up to the white population. But at the same time, I read another article that said that really the white population has not declined. It's just that people who might have considered themselves white in the last census are now changing to multiracial. So the people who did claim white, even some Hispanics in this past census, are claiming multiracial. So that's also, I'm saying, so it's also maybe a false sense, which is fueling the fear. I just was thinking about that as well, but we are better all, and I also say you cannot shut up the truth because of technology, because people travel. I read an article this morning that 50% of the Republicans want to return to the 1950s. I was not there. I wasn't born until 68. So I don't really know what was going on in the 50s other than what I read in the books. And I know it was not a good time for Black people, but they want to return to that time. And I was thinking to myself, how scary. And will they be able to do this? With all these right-wingers and hardliners that they're putting in place and then pushing out election officials. So those are some things that have been on my mind.
Yeah, and I think all of those are legitimate concerns. I do think people not reporting themselves as white and reporting themselves as multiracial, that may be progress in and of itself. It may signal that they see value in diversity a little bit more. But I'm not naive to a lot of those other things that's going on. And on demographics, if we look at the 50 plus population and the 18 and under population, it is two widely different worlds. All right, but 18 and under, those are the ones that's in school. 50 plus, they are more likely to make up, your teachers, your administrators, your school board members, people who are making the decisions. So we do have this big gap. And I talked about those who were born during who's living during Emmett Till. You have people who grew up in the Jim Crow era. They are, at least their parents were constructed Jim Crow. So you do have all of these types of things that we have to be aware of. But in the backdrop of all of that, we have technology and we have access to information that we didn't have before. We have increased capacity. So one of the things that I think about a lot is the idea of democratizing information, being transparent about data. If a school is 80% Black, but their AP programs are 20% Black, that's data that every family should know when they walk through the building. When you send your child to that school, you should know that. And so it's that kind of information that I think is the tools that we need to really fight the things that we need to fight. Fighting people's rhetoric, I think, distracts us. Fighting people's rhetoric, that's, at the end of the day, that's not directly responsible for whether or not my daughter gets in algebra 8th grade. And my daughter went to a school that was middle school, that was 90% Black. It was 10% white, but algebra in the 8th grade was 50% white. And my daughter was initially denied entry into the algebra class. And I raised a concern about the data at the school. And then they decided to give my daughter a different test, and she ended up getting in the class. She ended up making an A in the class, and now she's at a college preparatory high school now. But there was a fight that I had to fight with data for that school. So I hear what you're saying. I definitely hear what you're saying. But it's important for us to not be so daunted by the rhetoric that we miss these very specific things that's happening at the school that we need to continue to fight.
I like that. I wrote down democratizing data. That I never thought about like that, but yes, that's a good tool.
Yeah.
Perfect. It looks like we have one more question. I know we're tight on time, but one more question from Carmen.
Hi, great discussion. I have on the critical part of critical race theory, I just thought it meant like thinking critically, like not in a criticizing way. And I don't know if I misheard or what y'all were saying about that. And second, data in schools, I mean, it does bite them in the when it comes to them. When my husband became a principal here in our red community, and reading scores, were 27 to 30%. There was a reading gap of, a huge gap between the Hispanic kids and the white kids. Those teachers didn't like to be told that. But, he motivated them to correct it. It wasn't a criticism on them. It just, they just didn't know that the way they were doing teaching was not something that was helpful to the Latinx kids here in this community. But he changed the culture of how they thought, and whether they still were resentful or not, they came around and our scores, within a year. But they just had known that they were doing things that, like literature circles, did not work for kids from Latinx kids who may not have books at home and who were in extreme poverty. But anyway, so my question is mostly about the critical use of the word in critical race theory. So I mean, I know it sounds small, but maybe I had it like I didn't see it that way.
You brought together, I think, something that Suzanne had brought up earlier too, right? Like, I think part of the issue is a misunderstanding of the word, right? That it is a critique of whiteness or American history, or insert whatever other, thing someone's going to kind of focus on at the moment. So part of our conversations might be kind of taking a step back and saying, let's define the words in which we're using, right? Let's make sure we both have the same understanding of these words that we're using, because as we've been talking about kind of here, there, and everywhere, that a poor definition of something can be weaponized, right? And it can be used to kind of stop the conversation before it can even happen. If we're misunderstanding what critical means in critical race theory, in that we are looking critically at the past, we're looking critically at the systems within which we live and work and play. Not that we're criticizing American history or Americans or whiteness in general. I think you brought it all kind of together, and I'll let you take maybe the more data-driven question, Dr. Toldson.
Yeah, and I don't think that was a question about data. It was an observation, an astute observation that data can motivate. It could be a motivating factor that theories can't. But there's some published information about why certain hard right-wingers decide to use critical race theory to target, and they did talk about the language of it. They said that word critical was something that they found easy to demonize, and the theory aspect of it that was seen as academic, and they equate academics as being liberal, and just like Suzanne said, they don't like to read, and so the term theory in and of itself is kind of jarring to them. And so so they actually wrote that they targeted critical race theory because of how the name sounded, and they felt like it would create a certain reaction among them. So we do have to be careful with those words, or with how we interpret it and how we say what it is. And these are people who, for a long time, for 20 years, they were arguing against diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that was hard for them. Saying diversity, equity, and inclusion is wrong, that made them sound like racists. But for them to say critical race theory is wrong, it just makes them sound like they're attacking the elite. They're attacking people who are highbrowing. So all of these words matter in the context that they're being presented.
Can I just add on to what Carmen said?
Mm-hmm.
When I give the kids standardized testing or practice, the goal up in Massachusetts, I can only speak on, is part of what they're being tested on is critical thinking. This is something that is in, and I'm sure I know it's across the country. I don't know if some states don't do it, but this is an important, I don't know if that would help superintendents and school boards, saying critical thinking is something that we have done for a long time. It is not a negative thing. This is something that we want our kids to learn.
Yeah, I agree.
But you know what? I've enjoyed this conversation. I'm sorry I was late. I had an appointment, but I've enjoyed this. I just want to throw this out here as well as we move forward into the 21st century. We talk about minority to majority population, and talk about how, some areas people who are less educated, are fearful, some white people are fearful. Okay, we're becoming the minority. Does that mean that they're going to treat us the way we have treated them? I say no, but I think it's also important to realize, and I think this was important. I read it in AJC, a man who wrote it, he was biracial, part black, part white. And he said, when people are excited about us becoming the majority, people of color, they're really excited. They're not saying that they want white people to disappear. And I agree with him. he said, but what they're saying is they're excited because the racist systems are disappearing. So if the white structure becomes smaller, then the racist structure will just, will disappear. But he said that's a misnomer. He said you cannot get caught in that. He said racism will never disappear. It does not matter if the white race becomes smaller, it will just shift to a different racial group. And I thought that was interesting. So I think the work that has to go forward is we have to talk about diversity, acceptance and inclusion beyond just, racism is a white thing. I say only white people could be racist because they're the only ones that can control people's destiny because they do not like them. They control the political and the economic systems. However, we have to, I think there's a lot of work that has to be done is what's this going to look like? Just because they're the minority doesn't mean racism is going to disappear. Doesn't mean that, Black people will not move from the bottom caste. He had thrown out who he said the next, quote, racist would be. And I can see what he was saying. I think that that's something that we have to look at too. Don't get excited because, okay, now racism is going to disappear. It'll just shift to another group. And that's work that has to be continually done. Yeah, I'm sorry. Anita has her hand up.
You're on mute.
You're mute, unmute.
Sorry, I hate to throw something so depressing here, but it's a reality. We're involved politically. I own up to the Democrats here, and because of that, we have seen so much. The trouble with school boards is that they report to the parents and the homeowners, and that is fear that they're going to have 100,000 calls and irate parents and never get elected again. And we all know that school boards is a launching pad very often for someone that wants a political career. So they're not about to upset that apple cart without being pressed to do it. That's just fear. It's fear for their job. And the parents, and many of the parents, I'm not going to say all of them, but many of the parents and the homeowners go, oh no, here they come. They're going to flood the community. And they're still of the thought from the 60s that, home prices will go down if people of color move in. Well, here we are all this time later, and they're still somewhat afraid of that. Luckily, some of the school board meetings are attended by people of color. So that's helpful. But the school boards are a tough nut to crack. Look at what they do with the literature. Look at what they do with the books. It's just it's political. It's political with the school boards. And I think that as far as teachers teaching diversity and helping to understand our fiction history taught in many of the schools, I think that there's a fear that it will incite people of color, and then we'll have riots in the classroom because people are not, they're still divided. They're divided in the high schools, not as much in college, or going on to universities and things like that. But high schools, definitely. And so, I mean, look at it. Even the gangs are divided. Even they're divided. Knuckle draggers that they are, So I think that the schools are a good place to aim, teach people the truth while they're young, but trying to get authority to cooperate with that endeavor is a very snarly matter.
Yeah, I understand all of that. There tends to be a lot of tribalism in education. And a lot of that tribalism happens among people who are really disconnected from the experiences of students who are trying to learn through these systems, and parents that's trying to make the best decisions about their children. And one of the things that we always have to keep top of mind is that a lot of the debates that happen outside of the school, including the school board fights and the fights between different interest organizations, the unions and the charter movements, and all those types of things. A lot of parents are oblivious to it, and the choices that they have to make and the experiences of students, they tend not to, their needs tend to be very different than what people are fighting for on the outside. And that's one of the things that we have to, what I would say, and I know we're running short on time, is to always keep parents and children, particularly those who are underrepresented and who are represented in data, at the bottom of what's going on, always keep them at the forefront of our advocacy, because a lot of times that doesn't happen. So for me, it's about issues like who's graduating college ready? Are there differences by certain demographic groups? If there are demographic groups that are underrepresented in that, bring them to the table and try to figure out why. And the things that they are saying that they need and that's missing, that becomes our fight. And taking that strategy helps me to have a little bit more optimism and hope, because I'm keeping the people who are actually represented, who actually are affected by all this, I keep them close. I try to keep them as close as I possibly can. I always advocate, I always say that data is numbers, and numbers are people. And so you never lose sight of who's represented in that data. You amplify their voice, and that's our fight. And as we fight for all these different issues, and as we really dissect what's going on and have very specific things that we're angling for, including things like disproportionality, suspensions, all these types of things, very specific things that we want in order to make the process better. But society continues to change around us, and we can't lose sight on that either. So it's a tough fight. It's certainly a fight worth fighting, though. And I think the truth is on our side, and I think we're gonna come out victorious in the long run.
I thank you for that. I thank you for that answer. I'm taking it all in being an educator, because we're so focused on data. And at first I'm tired of data. That's just a way of, sectioning people, but that has to be the focus. I will share this. One of my colleagues, we do SSTs, we see what kids, what services they need, and we're very data driven. And she said to me, she said, Parker, she said, the white students and the middle class Blacks did not have any learning loss looking at the data. She said, they're right where they should be. In fact, they're above. And she was saying what you're saying. She said, so we're going to have to look at the ones who are, she was saying, who are underserved, who are, lower economic, because they don't have the same ground, she was saying, in our school as the white kids and the middle class Blacks. And I thought that was interesting, but it ties into what you were saying.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Amazing questions from everybody and a great dialogue. We want to thank our keynote speakers again for joining us and for educating us and sharing your knowledge. We are so grateful. So thank you to again. This will be posted on our YouTube. So if you need to come back to watch this video for reference, anybody, you can follow us, or you can watch this video back on our YouTube channel. And I'll post that in the chat, that way everybody has it.